Hello and welcome back. In this lecture we're going to talk about sensory structure and function, and I'm going to divide this particular lecture up into three sections. We'll do general senses, taste, and smell in this lecture, then we'll do hearing in a separate lecture, and we'll do the vision in a separate lecture. So let's go ahead and we'll start talking about the major senses of the body. So we do have general senses of the body. We have touch, pressure, temperature, and pain sensation. These are done generally all over our body, and this will be the main thrust of this lecture, is talking about general senses. We then have special senses, which are places where we have senses that are localized. For example, smell occurs in the nasal cavity. Of course, we have taste in the oral cavity. Hearing is going to be in your inner ear. Equilibrium in your inner ear, and then vision around your eyes. And those are called special senses because the sense organs are located in a very defined location. So general senses will be the thrust of this particular lecture, and general senses are going to use receptors that are basically all over your body. We do have different kinds of receptors. We have exterioreceptive senses, or exterioreceptive receptors. And these are senses associated with changes at the body's surface. For example, touch, pressure, temperature, and pain would all be exterioreceptive senses that you have generally in your skin and underlying your skin. We also have interoceptive senses. These are senses associated with changes in the viscera, that is your body organs, your internal body organs. So a couple of examples of interoceptive senses would be like blood vessels stretching. Digestive organs can stretch and they can sense chemicals. Many of the times you can't sense these particular senses. They're sent to your into your brain and spinal cord and are going to be basically mediating reflexes. Sometimes you can feel pain, interoceptive sense pain, and we'll talk more about pain in just a bit. We also have proprioceptive senses. Proprioceptive senses. These are senses associated with changes in muscles and tendons and changes in body position. Information from these senses are sent to the spinal cord and they help mediate reflexes that we have. So these senses that we have, these interoceptive and exteroceptive and proprioceptive senses, these are all going to have different kinds of receptors that are going to be the mechanism that we can sense different kinds of things. For example, we have chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors respond to changes in temperature. So we do have cool and warm chemoreceptors. Pain receptors respond to tissue damage. They are also known as nociceptors. Thermoreceptors respond to changes in temperature. So we do have hot and cold receptors. I believe I just said that for chemoreceptors, but I meant to do it for thermoreceptors. We do have hot and cold thermoreceptors. Mechanoreceptors respond to mechanical forces. For example, when a receptor is crushed or deformed, this will send information about mechanical forces to the brain. Photoreceptors respond to light energy or photons of light striking them. So these are the different kinds of receptor types that we have. Just to kind of give you a sense of some of these receptor types, we do have these things called free nerve endings. Free nerve endings are going to basically be mechanoreceptors. Free nerve endings can serve as thermoreceptors. Free nerve endings can be nociceptors or pain receptors. So we have a whole host of different free nerve endings that are basically acting to sense different things. So these free nerve endings can sense pressure and touch. These free nerve endings can do hot and cold reception, pain reception, and then also visceral pain or pain in the organs of the body. In the skin, we have tactile corpuscles, also known as Mesner corpuscles. They do touch and texture. We also have Pacinian corpuscles or lamellated corpuscles, which are going to do deep pressure or vibrations. And these can be in the skin and they can be deeper in different viscera or different body organs. Within the muscles, we have muscle spindles, which are mechanoreceptors, and we have Golgi tendon organs, which are found in tendons, which are mechanoreceptors. And these detect basically changes in the length or tension in the muscle or the tendon. And really you don't sense these particular things, so there's no sensation, but this information is sent to the spinal cord to allow it to understand what's happening in the muscles and what's happening in the tendons. Just to show you a couple of pictures, so in the skin we're going to have free nerve endings, which are going to do, fine touch. They're going to do, so they are mechanoreceptors. They're also heat and cold receptors and pain receptors. And these free nerve endings are just basically everywhere within the skin. Free nerve endings are also found really all throughout your viscera, your visceral organs, and throughout your body. In the skin, we do have Meissner's corpuscles. This is what it looks like under a microscope slide. And you can see them right here. These are all Meissner corpuscles right here, and they give us that fine touch reception in the skin. And then deeper in the skin, we have the Pacinian corpuscles, also known as lamellated corpuscles, and these are deeper pressure sensors that are within the skin. They have an interesting onion skin kind of look to them with layers and layers. When you look at the receptor, it's a pretty complicated receptor. Of course, it is attached to a nerve ending there that will then take that signal to the spinal cord. So these are just a few examples of receptors in the skin and a little bit deeper. A couple of examples of the mechanoreceptors. One of them is called the muscle spindle. You can see the muscle spindle right here. It's made of very specialized muscle tissue cells that are going to basically sense differences in the length of the muscle to send that information to the spinal cord. We then have also these Golgi tendon organs, which are located here in the tendon, and again that sends information about the stretch of the tendon to the spinal cord, so your body can understand where your body is in 3 dimensions and understand what's going on in those muscles and those tendons. So let me go ahead and define a few words when we talk about senses: sensation, perception, and projection, and then adaptation. Sensation is a word that we use when a sensory neuron sends information to the brain. So sensation occurs all throughout our body through the visceral organs, and that information is sent to the spinal cord and eventually to the brain. When that information reaches the brain, the interpretation of the sensory signals is considered to be perception, and then projection is what the brain does, where it takes and it sends back to the sensory receptor source the feeling of the sensation. So if you stick your finger on a tack, like for example the tip of your index finger, the brain will sense that information, it'll perceive that information, and then it'll project back into 3-dimensional space that sensation to that source. That's for our body to understand where the information is coming from, so that we might protect or understand what part of our body is being touched. This is a very complex phenomenon that we don't understand and really don't fully understand how that works. We just know that it does work. We know that you can get a phantom limb where you cut a finger off, and because the body part's no longer there, the brain doesn't really fully understand it and will project back into that particular 3-dimensional space the sensation of the finger. So you can get this thing called a phantom limb, where you still feel the limb or the finger or the part that's been lost, even though it's not there anymore. So that projection will project back into 3-dimensional space the sensation. Sometimes we have adaptation where we ignore unimportant stimuli. For example, right now, if you just felt your clothing on your body, you didn't feel that sensation until I just made you aware of it, but there's a lot of adaptation that goes on. So your brain really does filter out information coming into it, ignoring things that are unimportant, and really focusing only on things that are survival threatening. So that's called adaptation. So a few minutes from now, when you forget about your clothing on your body, you'll have adaptation and you won't sense the clothing on your body any longer. Just to show you how some of these kind of sensations are moving through the brain, we have talked about many of these brain parts. So let's kind of go through and let's see how fine touch, proprioception, and vibration, and then we'll also talk about temperature and pain, how those kind of flow through. So for fine touch, we're going to have sensors all throughout our skin or our body. They're going to basically go through the dorsal root and into the spinal cord. Once they go into the spinal cord, they're going to take an ascending track up into the medulla. Once they're in the medulla, there will be a crossing over to the opposite side. This sensation will then go to the thalamus. The thalamus will determine if it is worthy enough of getting to the cerebral cortex, and if it is, it'll send it to the somatosensory cortex. So that's how fine touch is going to go through. Now we'll do a little something different with nociception, whereas with pain perception. Pain perception is going to come through the dorsal root. It's going to go into the spinal cord and cross over to the opposite side at the level of the spinal cord. It then goes up through the medulla. It then goes through the thalamus, and from the thalamus it then will enter into the somatosensory cortex. Okay, so this is kind of the flow of information in terms of fine touch, proprioception, vibration, temperature, and pain perception, or reception, excuse me. This chart right here just shows a flow of information. We've been talking about sensory receptors basically in the body and in the body organs, and there is a flow of information. So the sensory receptors will send the information through, fibers, through nerve fibers. Those will eventually reach the central nervous system, the spinal cord, and then eventually higher up. Sensation will be basically done by the central nervous system, and then perception will be, where we make sense of that feeling, will be done by the central nervous system. So we will talk about smell and taste in just a few minutes, but smell has receptors in the nose. Those have nerves that carry the information to the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex will sense a pleasant smell, and then perception will be where we build, from that smell we will build the actual thing that's creating that smell. For example, an apple. Taste does a very similar thing. Taste buds are on the tongue. They have, use cranial nerves to send that information to the cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex will create the sensation of sweet taste, and then a perception will occur by the brain. That is the taste of a specific kind of item. All right, let's talk about pain for just a minute. Pain is an unpleasant sensation sent to the brain when tissues are being damaged. Tissue damage can be detected by nociceptors. These are pain receptors. They're all throughout your body, and they have free nerve fibers that are spread all throughout your body that have the ability to detect damage. So everywhere in the body except for brain nerve tissue are where these nociceptors are going to be. So generally speaking, we can feel pain everywhere except on the surface of the brain. Nociceptors are going to respond to a wide variety of things. Typically, these things they respond to are things that are dealing with damaged, with a damaged body or something that's going wrong in the body. For example, the buildup of hydrogen ions will be, something that the nociceptors will respond to and sense as pain. Potassium ions. So when your tissue is crushed, that high potassium inside cells will leak out, and that will be sensed by nociceptors. Proteins inside the cell will be released when a cell is crushed, and those will also be sensed by nociceptors. Histamines oftentimes released in places where you have inflammation and swelling, and that's a signal for nociceptors to send signals of pain. Lack of oxygen, also known as hypoxia, and then really super high and low temperatures. All these things will be basically information sent by nociceptors to the brain, because something's going wrong when you have these particular conditions being taking place. We do have fast pain fibers. These are known as alpha fibers, and these are myelinated, and they are fast, and they create sharp pain sensations. So if you've ever stepped on a tack before or cut yourself, that sharp, really fast pain is carried by these fast fibers. We then have slow pain fibers, which are C fibers, and these are unmyelinated. They're slow, and they create dull or chronic pain sensations. So we do have a fast pain, and we do have a slow pain that occurs when we have pain. Just to show you how pain is going to flow up to the brain. So here we have some kind of a damage down here. So the pain sensation will flow up a spinal nerve. It'll come back through the dorsal root. Okay, here is the sensory neuron cell body. in that dorsal root ganglion. So that information comes into the spinal cord. It's going to pick up an interneuron, cross over, and then pick up an ascending track. That ascending track is going to take it really to the reticular formation. The reticular formation will take it to the thalamus. The thalamus will choose to send it directly to the somatosensory cortex so we can perceive it. And it'll also send it to the limbic system so we can emotionally respond to it. The limbic system being our emotional response center of the brain. Now, there is some crosstalk over here from the thalamus over to this part called the periaqueductal gray matter, which is located right there. And this periaqueductal gray matter, it actually has fibers that go back to the spinal cord, and it can modulate pain so that it doesn't cripple you or paralyze you from responding or being able to survive the event. The modulation will occur through various kinds of neurotransmitters that are basically released from these modulating fibers, and calphalins is one of the big ones. These are natural painkillers that will aid in modulating and reducing or tamping down the pain. Okay, so we have transduction, we have transmission, we have the perception, and then we have modulation of the pain. Now, there are organs in our body that do have sensory nerve fibers or free nerve fibers that are innervating them and will sense when tissue damage occurs. And sometimes visceral pain is a little different than surface pain, like skin pain. Whenever you have a pain in your skin, you always feel it exactly where it's being taken place. So if you cut your elbow or cut your knee, you're always going to feel it at the elbow or the knee. That's not true when you have visceral pain, pain in your deep organs of your body. Many times pain in the deep organs of your body is going to be referred to other locations on the surface of your body. Let me show you why that happens, or at least why we think that happens. So here you have, let's say you had damage in your heart. We have a sensory nerve cell that's going to send that information up through a spinal nerve, and it's going to send it to the dorsal root ganglion, and then it's going to be processed here at the spinal cord. Okay, so but notice that the skin also sends information of pain to a very similar location. So that information goes up to the brain, and when the brain projects back into three-dimensional space where it thinks the information is coming from, sometimes it'll send it to the skin as opposed to sending it to the internal organ. It just gets confused, and so the projection is inaccurate, and it's sent to the surface skin that's using a similar path as the pain coming from that particular organ. Let me show you a picture of referred pain. So, for example, because the heart shares similar pathways with skin of the left arm, sometimes when you have a heart attack, you can actually feel a heart attack in your pinky. That's where the brain will project the information back to. So when you have a heart attack, you can feel it in your chest. You can feel it in your inner left arm, okay, all the way down in your inner left arm, all the way to your pinky. So just as another example, when you feel pain in your lungs or perhaps your diaphragm, which is your breathing muscle, that might be felt in your neck region. Okay, so that could be in the front or the back. If you ever had some problem with your kidneys, kidney stones, things of this nature, it can be all the way near your kidneys, which is really back here, but it could always also be cause leg pain, even inner thigh pain. So this is called referred pain. So it's important that if you ever go into the healthcare field, that you really listen to your patient, describe to you where they're having pain, because the pain that they're describing, it's going to be on the surface in the skin, and it may have nothing to do with the skin, but it could be a referred pain from a deep organ of the body. So listen very carefully, to your patients to understand where, they actually might be suffering some kind of damage, and it might not be the skin. Let me just talk about pain medications for just a second. This is a pretty important thing. NSAIDs, which are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, include drugs like aspirin and ibuprofen. Ibuprofen would be like Advil. And these particular chemicals are going to work by knocking out COX-1 and COX-2 enzymes. These enzymes are involved in making various kinds of products that are involved in pain, inflammation, and really creating things like fever. So if you knock out the COX-1 and COX-2 enzymes, which what NSAIDs do, then you knock out the production of chemicals that lead to pain, inflammation, and fever. So these NSAIDs are known to be analgesic, which means they basically take away pain. They're anti-inflammatory, taking away inflammation, and they're antipyretic, which means they take away fever. So if you ever have fever and light pain and some inflammation, NSAIDs are definitely used to get rid of these particular conditions. We have another really kind of miracle drug. It's called acetaminophen. Tylenol's probably the main one that you're familiar with. We have an unknown mechanism of action of how it works, but they are analgesic and they are antipyretic, which means they do knock away pain and they do take away fever, but they're not anti-inflammatory. So if you had some kind of a swelling, acetaminophen wouldn't be an effective drug to take for that particular condition. Opiates are going to be used for really, really strong pain. The opiates include things like morphine and heroin and oxycodone and hydrocodone. So these are all different kinds of opioids. Really the only opiate up there is probably morphine, but the rest of them are synthetic and those are opioids. But these are going to block voltage-gated sodium channels. If you block a voltage-gated sodium channel, a nerve cell can't send information about pain. It also opens up potassium channels. When you open up the potassium channels, that leaks out potassium, which decreases the resting membrane potential. And if you do that, then it's unlikely that a nerve cell will be able to send a signal of pain to the brain. So opiates are a more powerful type of pain medication compared to the NSAIDs and the acetaminophen. We also have a lot of different kinds of anesthetics. I didn't want to be all inclusive here. I just did some really surface or very light anesthetics here, lidocaine and benzocaine. These are two that are topical, or you can inject directly into the skin, and these will block voltage-gated sodium channels. So if you block the voltage-gated sodium channels of sensory nerve cells, then they can't send information about pain to the spinal cord and thus to the brain. Okay, so switching gears just a little bit, we're going to go from the general senses to the special senses. Special senses are senses that have sensory receptors associated with complex sensory organs in the head. Smell is going to be one of them, and they're localized in olfactory organs in the nasal cavity. Taste is going to be localized on taste buds that are found on the tongue. Of course, the eyes will have the retina, and these will be for vision or for sight. Hearing and equilibrium is going to use the inner ear, and so these are our special senses that we'll talk about. In this lecture, we're just going to deal with smell and taste. So olfaction is the sense of smell. Olfaction occurs in your nasal cavity. Just to orient you here you have your nostrils, you have your nasal conchae, and then at the very top of the nasal cavity, we have these nerve endings here of sensory nerve cells that are going to be able to sense odor molecules. These are going to collectively create cranial nerve number 1, which will link up with neurons in the olfactory bulb and be sent back to the brain for perception. Just to give you a little bit better sense of what's going on here, I got this a little bit more detailed picture. Just to orient you, here's the nasal cavity down here. Here is the ethmoid bone. These are the cribriform plates that we talked about when we did bones. These are little holes in the ethmoid bone that allow for the sensory nerve cells to dangle through into the nasal cavity. So we do have a layer of mucus that the odor molecules will dissolve in. We have olfactory neurons, which are right here, and they have these little cilia that have receptors that are going to sense chemicals or odor molecules. When they do sense an odor molecule, the information will basically travel up through this cranial nerve number 1, and then they'll synapse with these other output neurons, which are in the olfactory bulb, which will carry that information back to the temporal lobe for smell perception. Let me go back to the tongue. So the sense of taste is also known as gustation, and it's going to be done by taste buds. So if you look at the tongue here, these little papillae, which are these little pillars of skin, all of these papillae here, are going to have taste buds in them. So if we just take a look at a papilla, there's a papilla right there. Here's the top or the middle portion of the papilla. And then on the sides of the papilla, you can see there's little grooves right here. On the sides, there are the taste buds, which in this picture or image down here are blown up for you to be able to see that. So we do have little taste hairs, which are connected to sensory receptors or taste cells, and those are connected to nerves that send information, of course, to the brain so that we can perceive the sense of taste. So when you basically eat chemicals, you're going to have the fluids in your saliva liquefy them, and they'll get down into these grooves. The chemicals will touch receptors that are on these taste hairs. Once the receptor is stimulated, the nerve cell will be stimulated to send information back to the brain so that we can understand what chemical we are being exposed to. This is kind of the flow of information. Taste is kind of complicated. It's going to use 3 cranial nerves. So part of our taste is done by the vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10. Part of it's done by the glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve number 9. Part of it's done by the facial nerve or cranial nerve number 7. You can see how they're innervating different regions of the tongue and different parts of the papillae. So all this information is going to be sent up to the brain. So it's going to reach the medulla oblongata. It's then going to move up through and to the thalamus. The thalamus will then send that information over to the insular lobe or insula, and that's where we have our gustatory cortex, which is going to be involved in taste. So that's kind of how it kind of flows through. We do have receptors that can taste sweet. We have receptors that taste sour, salt, bitter, umami, which is kind of like a savory, metallic, meaty kind of flavor. And then, of course, pain perceptions are also sensed by the tongue as well. So both olfactory and gustatory senses use chemoreceptors. Chemicals must be dissolved in a watery solution. So we have watery mucus secretions in the nasal cavity, and then we have saliva in the mouth that's going to liquefy those chemicals so that the chemoreceptors can sense them. Olfaction sensed in the olfactory cortex located in the temporal lobe, and then gustation is going to be sensed by the gustatory cortex located in the insula. Okay, well that completes the small lecture on general senses, pain, and then we did the sense of taste and of smell. In our next lecture, we'll go ahead and tackle vision. I'll see you then. Bye.